Americans spend an entire month celebrating, commemorating, and remembering important people and events in the history of the African diaspora. Originally called Negro History Week, the celebration's week-long duration was originally chosen in 1926 to coincide with the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln on February the 12th and Frederick Douglass on February the 14th. By 1970, students at Kent State University in Ohio trialed a Black History Month, beginning on February the 2nd and finishing on February the 28th. Within 6 years, the movement had spread and was being celebrated all across the country, even popping up in selected countries overseas. Marked with controversy and opposition from the very beginning, Black History Month isn't just a celebration of African Americans and the part they played in shaping America. It's an acknowledgement that we all have a shared legacy, and without African Americans, the United States would be a very different country today. So it's safe to say, Black history is American history. Americans spend an entire month celebrating, commemorating, and remembering important people and events in the history of the African diaspora. Originally called Negro History Week, the celebration's week-long duration was originally chosen in 1926 to coincide with the birthdays of Abraham Lincoln on February the 12th and Frederick Douglass on February the 14th. By 1970, students at Kent State University in Ohio trialed a Black History Month, beginning on February the 2nd and finishing on February the 28th. Within 6 years, the movement had spread and was being celebrated all across the country, even popping up in selected countries overseas. Marked with controversy and opposition from the very beginning, Black History Month isn't just a celebration of African Americans and the part they played in shaping America. It's an acknowledgement that we all have a shared legacy, and without African Americans, the United States would be a very different country today. So it's safe to say, Black history is American history, but there's definitely more to the story. There's a lot you probably never knew about Black history. Welcome to Things You Probably Never Knew, the channel where if you didn't already know, you do now. Hit that subscribe button unless you already know everything, in which case, well done. In this video, part 1 of a 2-part series, we're going to take a look at the African American contribution to American history, the trials, tribulations, and ultimate triumphs. Ready? So let's get started. Most people assume the beginning of the African story in America starts with the mass transport of captured African Americans in 1619 for the purpose of slavery. However, you might be surprised to know that Africans had been in the New World since at least 1526. In September of 1526, Lucas Vasquez de Ayllon, together with 3 ships of 500 Spanish settlers, 100 horses, and 100 African slaves on board, landed near present-day Georgetown in South Carolina. The colony, however, was doomed to failure from the beginning. A supply ship full of stored food had sunk right before the colonists arrived, and it was too late in the season to plant crops. With dwindling food supplies, the colonists began to starve. Added to the pestilence, an unknown infectious disease had spread through the settlement, and within 3 months, 250 of the 500 settlers had died. In open revolt, the African slaves banded together, burning one of the colonists' leaders' homes and escaping into the forest, never to be seen again. Weeks later, the remaining Spanish abandoned the settlement and returned home. It would be almost 100 years until slavery would return to America. As colonies quickly spread across the country, the need for cheap labor grew exponentially. In 1619, an English-built privateer ship named the White Lion conquered and intercepted a Portuguese slave trader ship called the São João Batista. On board was approximately 22 African slaves that were captured and brought along for the journey to the New World. The White Lion delivered the slaves to the British colony of Jamestown in Virginia in 1619, and it would begin an era spanning more than 2 centuries of barbaric practices and inhumane treatment. Historians have tried to estimate the total number of Africans displaced during the period of slavery, with some experts estimating as high as 6 to 7 million slaves imported to the Americas during the 18th century alone. In the 17th and 18th centuries, enslaved Africans worked mostly on the plantations of the southern coast, tending to tobacco, rice, and indigo plantations. By 1776, the American Revolution hit the young nation. Angered by British taxes, the American colonists revolted against the Crown, taking control of the 13 colonies and driving out British loyalists. African soldiers served alongside the colonial patriots, who were, by 1778, offered freedom in return for their service. Over 5,000 free blacks and slaves fought in the American Revolution, with about the same number receiving their freedom as a result. In a surprising fact for the time, up to a quarter of all slaves were freed from their servitude following the Revolution. The American Revolution exposed a noticeable division between the northern and southern colonies, especially around the end of the 18th century. Much of slavery in America had been abolished by this time, except in the South, where improved cotton cultivation and profitability demanded a ready labor force. In August 1831, one slave in Virginia reached his last straw. Inheriting a passionate hatred of slavery from his African-born mother, Nat Turner looked to the heavens for a sign to spark a revolution. A solar eclipse in August was all the sign Nat needed to start an uprising. Gathering a group of around 75 other slaves, the revolt killed their plantation masters and marched towards the town of Jerusalem, where they planned to capture an armory and gather up more recruits. Up to 60 white people were murdered on their march to Jerusalem. While the revolution was eventually quashed by state militia, Turner escaped and spent 6 weeks on the run before being captured and hung for insurrection. By the early 19th century, the divide between the North and the South couldn't be starker. Anti-slavery campaigners from the North, many of them free black people, had begun helping slaves escape from southern plantations to the North via a loose network of safe houses as early as the 1780s, called the Underground Railroad. In 1846, a slave named Dred Scott unsuccessfully tried to buy his own freedom. He argued that he had lived in states and territories for years in which slavery had been abolished, so he had therefore earned his freedom. His claim would be denied. Scott would again sue for freedom in 1853, and after being again unsuccessful, took his fight all the way to the Supreme Court. The ruling from the Supreme Court would set a surprising and dangerous precedent. Chief Justice Roger B. Taney found that any persons descended from Africans, regardless of them being slaves or born free, were not entitled to U.S. citizenship. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln was elected as President of the United States, and his anti-slavery position was well known. This angered the South, who began severing ties with the Union, sparking the deadliest war in American history. 2 years into the American Civil War, on January 1, 1863, President Lincoln issued a preliminary Emancipation Proclamation declaring that all 3 million slaves within the Southern Confederacy were now free. Not only did this instantly deprive the South of the bulk of their labor force, but it also encouraged the now free African Americans to join the Union side in the war. Approximately 186,000 black soldiers joined the Union Army over the course of the war, with 38,000 being killed in battle. In 1865, the 13th Amendment would officially abolish slavery, but ongoing restrictions in the South, known as Black Codes, severely limited the rights of the ex-slaves. In 1868, the 14th Amendment granted equal protection to people who had been enslaved. In 1870, the Constitution received its 15th Amendment, guaranteeing that a citizen's right to vote would not be denied on account of race, color, or previous condition of servitude. Despite these advancements, many people in the South still rejected and resisted African American equality. Southern legislatures began enacting segregation laws, often nicknamed Jim Crow laws. Jim Crow was a blackface minstrel, and the name was used as a racial slur for freed black slaves after the Civil War. By 1885, most Southern states required separation of whites and colored people in education, transport, hotels, theaters, restaurants, and other establishments. On the 7th of June 1892, Homer Plessy agreed to test these new laws, believing they violated the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. Homer, who was of approximately 1/8 African heritage, bought a ticket on a train from New Orleans to Louisiana and sat down in a whites-only car. He was arrested after refusing to leave the car. On May 18, 1896, the Supreme Court upheld the Louisiana law that required segregation of railroad passengers based on skin color. This would establish the separate but equal doctrine that remained in place for decades to come. Throughout the beginning of the 20th century, violent hostility towards black people began increasing. Lynching, despite being illegal, was still common around the country. A wave of race riots began springing up across the country, most notably the Springfield, Illinois riot of 1908. This racial aggression would be the catalyst to the forming of a new permanent civil rights organization in 1909, the National Association for the Advancement of Colored People, or NAACP. The NAACP was instrumental in combating the Ku Klux Klan, reducing lynchings, and publishing African American voices in their official magazine, The Crisis. The 1920s was a period known as the Harlem Renaissance, a time of great migration of Black Americans from the rural South to the urban North. For the first time, African musicians, artists, authors, and politicians started to get national recognition. Iconic musician Louis Armstrong, dancer Josephine Baker, and actor Paul Robeson were some of the leading entertainment talents that emerged from this era. As World War II broke out across Europe, over 3 million African Americans would register to fight. Black and white soldiers were organized into separate units, in line with War Department policy. Doris Dory Miller, an untrained Navy steward on the USS West Virginia, would be the first African American war hero, receiving the Navy Cross for carrying wounded crew members to safety and manning a machine gun post, shooting down several Japanese planes during the attack on Pearl Harbor. 3 years after the war, in July 1948, President Harry S. Truman finally unified the U.S. Armed Forces under an executive order, stating that there will be an equality of treatment and opportunity for all persons in the armed services without regard to race, color, religion, or national origin. In 1954, the NAACP brought a case to the Supreme Court, arguing that racial segregation in public schools violated the 14th Amendment's mandate of equal protection. On May 17, 1954, the U.S. Supreme Court reversed the separate but equal ruling from 1896. On the 1st of December 1955, an African-American woman named Rosa Parks got on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. She was asked to give up her seat to a white man and refused. She was subsequently arrested and charged with violating the city's racial segregation ordinances. 4 days later, an activist organization led by a young pastor named Martin Luther King began a boycott of the bus company. King and 90 other participants of the boycott were indicted and found guilty under a law forbidding conspiracy to obstruct the operation of a business. Upon appeal, the federal court ruled that racially segregated seating on buses violated the 14th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution. In 1963, over 250,000 people marched on Washington in a demonstration for jobs and freedom. The crowd would gather at the Lincoln Memorial, where the famous "I Have a Dream" speech would be given by Martin Luther King, in which he called for equal opportunity for all people and an end to racial segregation. While we aren't there yet, King believed that one day we will live in a nation where we will not be judged by the color of our skin, but by the content of our character. It's clear that Black history is intertwined with American history, and despite their traumatic origins, American culture owes a lot of its greatness to African Americans.